Hi everyone, this is Group 1 here, and for our practice brief, we chose the topic of disenfranchised grief of suicide loss survivors, navigating grief for emerging adults aged 18 to 30. And our group is made up of McKenna, Tiffany, Katie, Avery, and Rebecca. We all came together because most of us have personal experience with this type of loss or this type of grief, and we all had an interest in learning how to better support suicide loss survivors with how high the prevalence of suicide is in our country. So we're going to start off with some definitions. So first off, we're going to talk about disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not recognized, validated, or supported in the mourner's social world. Those grieving suicide loss often will encounter blame, shame, exclusion, misunderstanding, and stigma. And a suicide death is a death caused by injuring oneself with the intent to die. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States overall, and the second leading cause of death in ages 15 to 34. A suicide loss survivor is a family member, a friend, or a loved one of someone who has died by suicide. It's estimated that approximately 45 million people have been impacted by a suicide loss just in the US alone, and that around 6 to 8 people are left to grieve the loss after completed suicide. And then lastly, emerging adulthood is a recently defined life phase covering ages about 18 to 30. And we did just want to acknowledge that these definitions are coming from a dominant Eurocentric perspective. So, for example, this idea of emerging adulthood and the milestones that are often attached to it are socially constructed and may or may not be relevant to some communities or cultures. But for the purpose of this brief, as we're talking about disenfranchised grief within suicide loss survivors, this is the age group that we will be referring to.
Suicide is the second leading cause of death for individuals in emerging adulthood, ages 15 to 34. Social norms govern what losses are deemed worthy of acknowledgement and seldom acknowledges death by suicide in the same way as other deaths. Social norms also govern who can legitimately grieve and for how long. The bereaved receive less social support and empathy from others needed to process the grief. Some religions limit grief rituals for those bereaved by suicide, and most insurance policies have clauses that further stigmatize this form of death and grief by making it harder, if not impossible, for beneficiaries to receive benefits. Due to the traumatic nature of suicide and stigma attached to the loss, in addition to typical feelings associated with grief, a person experiencing disenfranchised grief may exhibit symptoms of insomnia, anxiety, depression, shame, substance misuse, isolation, avoidance, feelings of anger and betrayal, a preoccupation that the survived could have somehow prevented the death, feelings of guilt, and distressing and persistent thoughts related to the death.
Some of the consequences to consider when thinking about emerging adults who are experiencing disenfranchised grief due to suicide, losing a loved one, friend, partner, sibling, etc., are the developmental tasks that are typically occurring during emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is a time of immense change and developmental changes as well. The term emerging adulthood was coined by the developmental psychologist Arnett. Arnett theorized that there were 5 different features that were supposed to occur during emerging adulthood. These included identity explorations, instability, self-focus, feeling in between, and anticipating many possibilities. Emerging adulthood contains many different changes, including different identity changes, lots of instability, and there are different developmental changes in the following areas. Looking at biological development of emerging adults, it's important to note that the brain is not fully developed roughly until age 25, it's believed. Brain development is not complete until the prefrontal cortex integrates and executive functions are working. This is a massive amount of biological change that emerging adults are experiencing. Once these changes in the brain are complete, it's believed that our brains become adaptive, energized, coherent, stable, and flexible. Experiencing disenfranchised grief due to a suicide loss may impact these developmental changes, as well as the following developmental changes. For psychological development during emerging adulthood, this is a time of moving towards self-sufficiency. This time is not for settling down, but instead exploring different identities, experiences, and hopes and dreams. Arnett also classified certain subtasks of emerging adulthood. These include accepting responsibility, making independent decisions, and financial independence, which is an immense privilege to be considered. Overall, this time is incredibly unstable and includes a lot of exploring. There are other identity processes that can happen during this time as well, such as identity diffusion, foreclosure, or actually achieving a certain identity. Another task of emerging adulthood is really grappling and wrestling with the belief in a just world. The belief in a just world is defined as a theory of justice that has as its basic premise the notion that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. In emerging adulthoods, individuals can experience a change and disruption of their assumptive world. Another area that emerging adults have to grapple with is their spiritual development during emerging adulthood. This often looks like emerging adults exploring and examining their relationships to spirituality and religion. Often these beliefs, spiritual and religious practices, are solidified during this time period if they have not already been solidified. These are only a few of the circumstances to consider when engaging with emerging adults who are experiencing disenfranchised grief due to suicide losses. There are many consequences of experiencing disenfranchised grief during the time of emerging adulthood. The relationships that emerging adults have spent their lives building can often be extremely impactful when lost. However, even though this can be incredibly devastating, research shows that emerging adults often display immense amounts of resilience, which is incredibly protective even during these experiences. Emerging adults also frequently experience something called post-traumatic growth. When emerging adults lose friends or partners to suicide, they often experience disenfranchised grief. Friends and partners often aren't considered as legitimate as family members and people related to the individual who has been lost. This can exacerbate the symptoms of disenfranchised grief for emerging adults. It can be difficult for emerging adults as they're in this period of so many different changes, exploration, changes in jobs and relationships to experience a loss due to suicide on top of all of these additional changes. It can be a challenge to balance the activities of grieving and experiencing the disenfranchised grief with the activities of emerging adulthood. Grief alone is difficult to manage, but when emerging adults experience disenfranchised grief due to loss by suicide, while also trying to navigate the many challenges of emerging adulthood, it can be a compounding experience.
Suggestions on how to support and address grief in emerging adults due to the loss of a family member or friends to suicide. The most common suggestion we found was peer support groups or peer counseling. Emerging adults can be difficult to engage in formal therapy due to their developmental preference for autonomy, and they are more likely to engage in a peer support program. Emerging adults place a lot of importance on peer relationships, however, may find that same-age friends have a hard time empathizing with them regarding loss, so peer support groups can provide them with peers who have had similar experiences. The second suggestion is individual counseling, ideally paired with peer support. Emerging adults, especially those on the younger end of the spectrum, can lack psychosocial maturity, which can limit their empathy and insight regarding suicide. This can present as anger being the main emotional expression, which can negatively impact their relationships. Individual counseling can be helpful to address and process these emotions. Our next suggestion is providing psychoeducation and support and normalizing emotional reactions around the grieving process. One example would be addressing that emerging adults have a propensity to misuse substances during the grieving process. Our fourth suggestion is a use of digital resources, such as online support groups, which have been found to be beneficial for those grieving a lost loved one due to suicide. Some of the positive aspects of an online support group is that you can access it at any time, 24/7. You can find information, and you can share experiences and discuss stigmatized issues. Another online resource is online memorials, such as on Facebook or other platforms, which can be helpful or which can provide a space for friends to grieve. As friends' grief is often disenfranchised or not seen as central as the family member's grief. One study does suggest that the use of online memorials may have a negative impact as they can increase rumination. However, there was some differing information on that. And lastly, the use of alternative forms of expression other than verbal processing. So, for example, using art or photography or other creative forms. This can be helpful for anyone, but may particularly be helpful with emerging adult men, as social norms may result in men having a lack of overt emotional expression, and they may feel more able to express themselves if given alternative choices.
For our additional readings, we included the Ducky Center website. The Ducky Center is an organization based in Portland, Oregon, which aims to provide grief support in a safe space where emerging adults and their families can share their experience before and after a death. They provide age-specific support in the form of education and training, grief campaigns, volunteer opportunities, grief activities, and psychoeducational articles. The Ducky Center provides other resources that may be particularly helpful for emerging adults, including support groups and a podcast. There is one group for adults aged 18 to 25 and two for adults aged 26 to 40, all of which are ongoing and based on a peer support model. The podcast is easily accessible and features episodes on topics including the relationship between suicide and anxiety, caring for the body, mind, and spirit while grieving, language, suicide and stigma, and the myth of the grief timeline. We also included the book The Other Side of Sadness by George A. Bonanno. In this book, George A. Bonanno centers postmodern grief theories and concepts of resilience. He talks about different trajectories of grief and emphasizes its nonlinear and ongoing processes. He discusses the temporary nature of feelings and our underestimated ability to be resilient when faced with grief, and includes discourse focusing on the importance of continuing bonds. Bonanno also talks about his personal experience losing his father and highlights different cultural traditions and perspectives of grief and death. And finally, we included the poem Spell for Grief or Letting Go by Adrienne Maree Brown. Adrienne Maree Brown is a writer, activist, Black feminist, and an emerging adult herself who gives us with her radical and tender approach to grief in her poem, Spell for Grief or Letting Go. In her compassionate words, she offers us insight and enlightenment to guide us through our grief.